The story of a medieval knight doesn't begin with a shining sword or a proud horse. It begins with a child, usually no older than 7, taken from the warmth of his home and placed under the strict care of another noble household. But before we go deeper into that world, if you enjoy these calm journeys into the past, I'd be grateful if you gently tapped subscribe. It truly helps this small channel grow, and it means more than you know. Thank you. Now let's drift back to the Middle Ages. The truth is that very few people ever had a real chance of becoming a knight. It wasn't something you applied for the way someone today joins the military. It wasn't a dream you chased because you loved adventure. In the 13th century world of feudal Europe, knighthood was a path you were born onto, often before you were even old enough to understand what any of it meant. Families planned it, lords expected it, society assumed it. And so, at about 7 years old, a boy of minor nobility became a page, the very first step. He would leave home, sometimes crying, sometimes brave, but always stepping into a life that belonged more to his family's status than to his own wishes. He learned manners first, because a knight wasn't just a fighter. He was expected to embody a kind of controlled, courtly behaviour. He learned to serve at the table, carrying jugs, pouring wine, and watching how the adults manoeuvred through politics disguised as politeness. As the years passed, his days grew more physical. He learned to ride, not the dramatic charges from movies, but the careful, everyday discipline of horsemanship, grooming, feeding, and understanding an animal that would one day have to carry him into danger. He practiced with wooden swords, heavy, splintering things that stung the hands and bruised the wrists, and he learned that pain was simply part of the process. At around 14, he advanced to the second stage, Squire. This was the moment the work became real. A squire lived in the shadow of a full knight, tending armour, sharpening weapons, lifting shields so heavy they rattled his bones. He learned to fight not in theory but up close, in brutal drills that pressed him backward through mud, sweat and fear. Medieval combat wasn't elegant, it was a storm of force, weight and exhaustion. And so the squire spent every day training his body to bear the load. What's rarely shown in film is that a squire wasn't just preparing for glory. He was preparing for a job that demanded constant service and constant submission. He woke before dawn, cared for horses, maintained gear that rusted easily in the damp winter air, and stood ready to assist his knight at a moment's notice. There was pride in it, but not much romance. When the time came, usually around 18 to 21, the path ended in the knighting ceremony. This event could be beautiful or simple, depending on the family's wealth. Sometimes it came after years of planning, other times it came suddenly, even on the battlefield, if a lord needed to reward loyalty or replace fallen warriors quickly. But for most young men, it marked a shift, not into freedom, but into responsibility. Because being a knight wasn't a personal achievement, it was a feudal duty. A knight served a lord, the lord served someone higher, and the entire system rested on layers of obligation thicker than the armour itself. A knight's life wasn't lived in castles, despite what modern art tends to show. Most knights lived in manor houses, stone or timber homes that were functional, not grand. They oversaw farmland, handled legal disputes from villagers, collected rents and managed tenants who depended on them for protection. War was only a fraction of their life. Daily existence was filled with paperwork, negotiations, crop yields, and maintaining a household that constantly needed resources. And that armour, the symbol of their identity, was an enormous burden. People sometimes imagine knights as wealthy, but the truth is that knighthood was expensive. A warhorse could cost as much as a small farm. Good armour had to be repaired endlessly, hammered and riveted by skilled smiths. Weapons chipped, cracked, and dulled with every use. Many knights lived right on the financial edge, struggling to maintain the appearance of status their role demanded. Even the social expectations weighed heavily. Knights were meant to embody chivalry, but the historical reality was far more complicated. The codes of honour were ideals, often written after the fact, not daily practice. A knight could be noble, yes, but he could also be violent, overworked, politically trapped, or deeply in debt. His reputation mattered immensely, yet his actual life was rarely glamorous. When war did come, it shattered any remaining illusions. Medieval combat was slow, suffocating, and unimaginably exhausting. Armour protected the body but drained the strength. A knight who fell from his horse risked being crushed, not slain by a clean blade. Mud sucked at boots. Smoke from burning wood and tar filled the air. Commands vanished under the roar. In the chaos, strength mattered as much as skill, and luck mattered more than both. And yet, despite all this, many families pushed their sons into knighthood because it offered one thing peasants could never hope for: status. With knighthood came legal privileges, social rank, and the right to hold land. The risks were enormous, but the class identity was powerful. In a stratified medieval world, being a knight meant you stood above almost everyone else. But here's the real truth. Very few boys who began the path ever saw the life shown in movies. They didn't live in storybook castles. They didn't spend their days in glorious battle. They weren't surrounded by polished armour that gleamed in the sun. They lived in drafty manors, training relentlessly, managing estates, serving the demands of their lord, and carrying the weight of obligations they never chose. Their world was built on mud, iron, and duty, not spectacle. So if you were suddenly dropped into the Middle Ages and told to survive as a knight, you wouldn't face a heroic quest. You'd face a lifetime of inherited demands, endless physical strain, and the grinding reality of a role that looked noble from a distance but felt heavy up close. And that's where our journey begins, not with glory but with the truth. Dawn creeps into the knight's chamber, thin and pale, slipping through a narrow slit in the stone wall. The room is cold, the flagstones colder, and the only warmth comes from the faint scent of old leather and wool that clings to the air. Before the knight thinks about duty or courage, he thinks about his armour, because that's the first battle of the day. It waits in the corner like a heavy responsibility, which it is. 45 to 60 pounds of metal that looks heroic from a distance but feels very different when strapped directly to your body. Knights didn't wake up wanting adventure. They woke up hoping the straps hadn't stiffened overnight. A squire arrives quietly, carrying the gambeson, the padded underlayer that's supposed to prevent chafing, although that's an optimistic way to describe it. The gambeson goes on first, thick and quilted, instantly trapping heat that wasn't even there a moment ago. It smells faintly of sweat and smoke, no matter how much sun it sees. Then the metal begins. Greaves for the shins, cuisses for the thighs, pieces that always pinch somewhere, no matter how perfectly they're adjusted. The squire apologises with every buckle, and the knight always says it's fine, though both know it isn't. The armour is not built to negotiate with skin. The breastplate follows. Breathing becomes a restricted luxury. The squire tightens straps along the knight's ribs, and the world suddenly feels smaller. a knight in full armour lives on half-breaths and determination. Pauldrons settle heavily over the shoulders. Arm harnesses slide into place. The gauntlets come last, turning hands into stiff metal claws that can grip a sword but struggle with anything delicate. Dropping something is a problem, picking it up is a bigger one. By the time the knight stands fully armoured, the day hasn't even begun and he's already tired. Inside the armour, everything feels compressed. Heat, breath, movement and hope. Walking becomes a careful clank and shuffle. Movies show knights moving gracefully. Medieval reality shows them trying not to knock their helmet into the doorframe. Every step offers a reminder that steel may bend, but it does not bend with compassion. Outside, the air smells of hay, leather, and horses, real medieval perfume. The destrier stands ready, powerful, trained, and perfectly capable of stepping sideways at the wrong moment just to keep things interesting. Knights respected their horses, and occasionally feared them because a destrier had opinions. Mounting is awkward. The squire braces the stirrup. The knight lifts a heavy leg and tries not to tip. There's always a moment where gravity thinks about having fun. Once settled in the saddle, the armour shifts sharply, metal squeezing into new places, reminding the knight he is only a renter inside this steel shell. Then comes the heat. Armour doesn't breathe. It traps warmth instantly, even in cold weather. Sweat gathers at the back, under the arms, behind the knees. The gambeson soaks it up like a loyal, suffering friend. Within an hour, the knight smells like effort and regret. Mobility is limited to what the armour allows. A knight can swing a sword, but the idea of bending to fix a loose strap is laughable. Turning the head gives only a narrow window of vision. Whatever lies outside that tunnel simply doesn't exist. If a bird flies to the left, the knight sees it only if it kindly flies into the centre of his view. Still, the knight pushes through. Training builds strength, endurance, and a sort of quiet acceptance. Knights learned to move well in armour, not because it was easy, but because living demanded it. They walked, ran, fought, patrolled, supervised, and hunted with armour, doing everything it could to make each task harder. Sitting is always undignified. A knight in armour folds downward like collapsing furniture. Eating in armour is worse. Elbows bump into plates, gauntlets slip on trenchers. Anything requiring precision becomes a group project with the squire. By midday, the knight is sweating steadily and breathing shallowly. His shoulders ache from the weight, and the saddle has created pressure points he'll definitely feel tomorrow. The armour works against him all day, tugging here, squeezing there, fighting its own private war on the human inside it. Sometimes the squire loosens straps for a brief moment of relief. It helps, but only slightly. Once the straps tighten again, the armour settles back into its favourite hobby, challenging the knight's willpower. Afternoons are filled with duties that have nothing to do with heroism. Patrols, estate management, checking crops, hearing disputes, training younger squires. Every job is harder in armour. Every step pulls energy away. The knight endures because endurance is the real definition of knighthood, much more than honour or shining moments in battle. The truth is that battles were rare. Armour was worn constantly, and armour was exhausting constantly. By the time the sun sinks toward the horizon, the knight returns to the manor, drained not by danger, but by metal, heat, friction, and gravity. Removing the armour becomes a small miracle. Piece by piece, the squire unbuckles straps, lifts plates, and frees the knight from his portable furnace, When the breastplate finally comes off, the knight takes his first full breath of the day, and it feels like a gift. Underneath, the gambeson is soaked. Bruises have formed in familiar patterns. Muscles ache from the constant load. And this is the part medieval stories forget to tell. Armour doesn't just protect the knight. It wears him down, slowly, daily, quietly. Before any battle ever begins, the armour has already fought him. And on most days, the armour wins long before the sword leaves its sheath. Training begins before the knight's body has truly shaken off the weight of sleep. Even without the armour, he feels the echo of yesterday's burden in his shoulders, a dull ghost weight that sits just heavy enough to remind him of the work ahead. The morning air is cold and quiet, carrying the scent of damp earth, crushed grass, and the faint charcoal breath of the manor's hearth. Dew clings to everything. The world feels fresh, but the knight does not. Still, he steps into the training yard because knighthood is built on routine long before it's built on glory. Sword drills begin first, as they always do. The longsword has no interest in making this easy. It's balanced, yes, but it is not light, and each swing carries weight that pulls through the arms and shoulders. The knight starts slowly, warming the muscles, carving familiar patterns through the morning air. Downward cuts, cross cuts, recoveries, resets. The steel whispers with each motion, steady but unforgiving, as if reminding him that technique is built on repetition, and repetition is built on endurance. His squire stands to the side, not judging, but certainly paying attention. Every so often he calls out reminders about stance or elbow position, each correction cutting through the quiet like a pebble tossed into a still pond. It's helpful, irritating, and absolutely necessary. As the drills speed up, the knight's body begins to warm. Sweat forms along his brow and trickles down the back of his neck, mixing uncomfortably with the chilly air. His breathing deepens, then evens out, then finally settles into the familiar rhythm of practiced effort. This part of training is deceptively simple. No enemies, no chaos, no fear, just motion and refinement. But the weight of the blade wears him down all the same. Rarely does anyone talk about how quickly a knight's arms can fail. Strength is not enough. Endurance is everything. When the squire judges the sword work to be sufficient, he brings over a battered wooden shield. Thick, heavy, and built with the subtle goal of making the knight regret every life decision that led him here. Shield drills look uneventful from the outside. From the inside, they are a slow form of punishment. The squire swings a wooden waster, a training blade, at the shield with a steady rhythm. Each strike sends a shock through the knight's forearm, up into the shoulder, and sometimes all the way through the spine. The blows aren't meant to injure, they are meant to teach the body how to absorb force without collapsing under it. It is not glamorous work. It is not even particularly dramatic. It is simply impact after impact, shaking muscles loose and dulling the nerves until the arm goes numb. And a numb arm is better than a weak one. That's the theory anyway. Dust rises gently with each shift of the knight's feet, catching morning light in soft golden clouds. The world looks serene around him, even peaceful, but his arm trembles from the bombardment. He holds the shield higher, braces differently, adjusts his stance. These small corrections are the only thing keeping the fatigue from taking over entirely. After enough hits, the squire finally stops, not because the knight looks ready, but because the drill has accomplished its single purpose to drain energy without removing the knight's ability to think clearly. A knight must fight exhausted. Training makes sure he knows how. Next comes archery. The bow is simple, unembellished, and far less romantic than stories make it sound. Drawing it after the sword and shield work feels like being asked to move a boulder with string. The knight inhales and draws, muscles in the back tugging painfully as he holds the tension long enough to steady his aim. His breath controls the shot more than his arms do. A slow exhale, a gentle release, a soft thump as the arrow sinks into the target. Archery teaches patience, stillness, and precision, which is mildly ironic considering knights spent most of their time loudly clattering through life. But the skill is useful, especially when defending a wall or hunting game for the manor. After a dozen shots, the knight's arms ache in new places. After 24, they ache everywhere. When the bow finally returns to its rack, the squire brings the destrier into the yard. The horse looks refreshed, almost eager. The knight would trade places with him if he could. Lance practice is heavy, awkward work. The lance itself is long and front-heavy, designed less for elegance and more for raw force. It demands balance, coordination, and stamina in a way the sword does not. The knight mounts the destrier and settles in, muscles protesting from earlier drills. Settling the lance under his arm takes effort, keeping it steady takes more. The squire calls out reminders as the knight begins the first charge. The destrier starts at a walk, then a trot, then a controlled run. Every increase in speed makes the lance feel heavier, pulling forward like a living branch. The knight adjusts his posture to counterbalance the weight. Ahead of him, the wooden practice target waits, a mounted shield on a rotating post designed to spin wildly if struck off center. The destrier picks up speed. The wind sharpens around him. The knight lowers the lance and braces as the target approaches. The impact lands with a deep, resonant thud that jolts the entire arm. The post spins sharply, the horse snorts almost mockingly as if pleased by the disruption. A few more charges follow. Each one drains a little more strength from the knight's shoulders and back. Sweat gathers beneath the tunic, dust clings to his boots, and his breath grows shorter. But he keeps going because training is not about feeling ready. It's about preparing for moments when he won't be. By the 5th run, his grip slips slightly from sweat, and the squire quietly notes the mistake. The knight corrects it on the next pass. Improvement isn't dramatic here. It's incremental, almost invisible, but vital. When the lance drills conclude, the knight rides back toward his squire, arms shaking from the repeated impacts. A water skin appears at his side and he drinks slowly, trying to steady his breath. The squire doesn't comment, though he watches closely. A squire learns a knight's limits long before a knight admits to having any. Training closes with slower exercises, footwork, controlled breathing, and steady stances that test balance rather than strength. These drills look easy, but they burn just as fiercely as the earlier work. The knight moves in broad, slow patterns, redistributing his weight from heel to toe, adjusting the angle of his hips, feeling every small instability in the ground beneath him. Dust stirs around his boots, catching in the folds of his clothing. His arms tremble with fatigue, but he presses through each movement with determined calm. By the time the session ends, the sun has only climbed a little above the horizon. Most of the manor is just beginning to wake, but the knight already feels the exhaustion of a full day. His muscles are tight, his breath shallow, and his mind focused solely on staying upright long enough to reach a bench or anything resembling a place to sit. Sweat clings to his skin, drying unevenly in the morning breeze. His hands ache, his shoulders throb, and the dull shock of the shield drill still hums faintly in his bones. And yet, this is only practice, routine, expected, required. People like to imagine knighthood as a life of courage, honour, and heroic battles. But the truth, the quiet truth, that knighthood is built on this daily erosion of strength. Sweating at dawn, trembling before noon, rebuilding muscle that will only be torn down again tomorrow. You don't become a knight by charging into battle. You become one by surviving mornings like this. And most days, the training drains you long before the real dangers ever arrive. A knight's day might begin with steel, sweat and exhaustion, but it always returned to something humbler. Food. Not feasts or elaborate spreads, but the simple, steady meals of a household that lived by the rhythms of land, hearth, and the work of its tenants. A knight's table wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to keep him standing. And the kitchen, warm, smoky, always alive, was the quiet centre of the manor. A place where the day finally slowed enough for a man to breathe. Most mornings began with the same familiar anchor. Rye bread. Dense, dark and slightly sour, it filled the stomach with slow-burning strength. Knights tore pieces from the loaf and dipped them into pottage or broth to soften the hearty crust. Cheese followed, not the clean white blocks of today, but firmer, saltier rounds that kept well and tasted of pasture and cool cellar air. Nothing fancy, but reliable and comforting. Pottage itself was the real staple. Simmering constantly in the kitchen cauldron, it absorbed whatever ingredients the household had. Barley, oats, leeks, onions, turnips, cabbage, or leftover scraps from yesterday's stew. Every day's batch tasted different. Some mornings it leaned earthy, others brighter with herbs the cook tucked into the bubbling pot. When steam rose in slow curls and the smell drifted through the hall, it softened the edges of a hard morning. A knight, weary from drills, could sit with a bowl of pottage and feel his body loosen, if only for a moment. Midday meals were simpler still. More bread and cheese, maybe a handful of dried fruit, or oats mixed with a bit of honey if the household had enough to spare. People romanticize medieval meat consumption, but knights didn't eat roasted boar every afternoon. Meat appeared when the household slaughtered an animal or when hunting was successful. On ordinary days, the meat in a meal was often little more than a strip of salted pork or a bone boiled long enough to give the broth flavour. Leftover stew was common, reheated and thickened, stretched further with grains or more vegetables. Its scent, smoky, herbal, quietly rich, settled into the wooden beams of the kitchen. Ale was the everyday drink, brewed weak and mild, not to get drunk, but to stay hydrated. Water wasn't always dependable, so ale filled the gap. Mead appeared for special moments, and young wine when merchants passed through. But most days a knight lifted a wooden cup filled with something cloudy, warm and reliable. Even its scent, yeast and barley, carried a comfort of its own. The kitchen hearth itself was the soul of the manor. It never truly went cold. The fire burned nearly always, feeding the cauldron, warming the cook's hands, and sending soft waves of heat into the room. The air carried layers of fragrance, simmering stew, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the faint sweetness of onions softening in fat. A knight stepping inside after cold drills felt the warmth sink into his bones. This was the kind of heat that didn't blaze. It wrapped gently like a wool cloak after frost. Afternoon bites were small. Dried apples, preserved berries, cold pottage hardened into something closer to bread than soup. Nothing was wasted in a medieval kitchen. Yesterday's meal became today's fuel in some new form. A knight learned quickly that complaining only earned him a sharper look from the cook. Dinner finally brought a sense of calm. It wasn't elaborate, but it was the moment the household gathered. Bread, cheese and pottage appeared again, but often with a little more intention. Maybe a slice of smoked fish, or a few pieces of mutton stretched across several bowls. The knight ate slowly, letting the warmth ease the day's fatigue as the fire glowed against the stone walls. The conversations were soft, mostly about weather, work, or next season's crops. In the medieval world, small talk revolved around survival, not stories. On days when stew was served, its flavour ran deep. The few pieces of meat, precious and carefully rationed, had simmered for hours, softening into the broth until they nearly disappeared. The rye bread soaked up every drop. Steam rose gently from each bowl, brushing the knight's face as he leaned in. Even in silence, meals like this felt grounding. They reminded him of the household behind him, cooks, servants, tenants, family, all connected by the same fire. Meals reflected the land itself. Barley from nearby fields, vegetables from the manor garden, herbs from the forest edge, fruit preserved from last season's harvest. A knight's plate was a quiet map of his surroundings. That connection mattered. Though a knight ranked above peasants, his food wasn't dramatically richer. Abundance wasn't constant for anyone. On rare evenings, sweetness appeared, raisins, figs, or dried apples. Such moments felt special. A knight biting into a fig tasted summer, preserved against the cold. It was a small luxury, but medieval life was built on small luxuries. They mattered far more than feasts that happened only a handful of times a year. As night settled, the kitchen hearth dimmed. Smoke drifted upward into rafters already stained with decades of cooking. The cauldron, scraped nearly clean, held enough for tomorrow's pottage. The cook stirred it a final time, letting the last bubbles fade. A knight lingering nearby might close his eyes, listening to that low murmur of simmering liquid. The same sound that had carried him through countless days. There was comfort in that consistency, a promise that after labour and duty and armour and training, something warm waited here. Food didn't define knighthood, but it sustained it. Not through extravagance, but through steadiness. Bread that filled, cheese that kept, stews that warmed, drinks that hydrated and soothed. These meals carried him from dawn to dusk, from exhaustion to readiness, from today's burdens into tomorrow's demands. For a man built to endure physically, socially and spiritually, this quiet nourishment mattered deeply. It didn't shine like armour or impress like ceremony, but it was the one part of his life that offered warmth without expectation. And for someone who spent most of his time inside steel, on horseback or in the cold morning air, that warmth mattered more than most people today could ever guess. When people imagine the life of a medieval knight, they picture the action, the charge, the clash, the banners lifting in the wind. Almost no one imagines the quiet hours that came afterward, when a knight set aside the weight of his armour and stepped into a different kind of obligation. The slow, endless work of keeping his equipment alive. Steel didn't maintain itself. Leather didn't stay soft without care. A destrier wasn't just a mount. It was a living partner that demanded grooming, feeding, and patience. And so long after the drills ended and the morning sweat had dried, the knight began another kind of labour. Quieter, steadier, and every bit as essential as combat training. The first task was usually the weapons, not because they were glamorous, but because they were vulnerable. A sword dulled after only a few hours of real use. Even drills wore the edge unevenly. The knight would sit near the hearth or in the open-air courtyard, depending on the season, with a whetstone resting across his knee. The rhythmic scrape of metal against stone filled the quiet, a steady, almost meditative sound. He moved the blade with slow, practiced strokes, drawing it along the whetstone, feeling the faint vibration travel up his arm. Sharpening wasn't about aggression, it was about patience. A blade coaxed into sharpness lasted longer than a blade forced there. Oil came next. The knight used a small cloth, dipped lightly into animal fat or plant oil, and rubbed it slowly along the steel. The scent was faint but familiar, a mix of metal, cloth, fibres, and a hint of something earthy. Tiny streaks of rust, often hid near the fuller or around the guard. He searched for them carefully, rubbing until they surrendered. Rust was always waiting, always creeping in from the edges. Any knight who neglected it quickly paid the price. Even the most skilled swordsman became vulnerable when his blade turned brittle. The shield required its own care, its wooden core, bound with leather and iron, soaked up moisture from the air. Cracks formed if it dried too quickly. The leather shrank if exposed to heat for too long. The knight inspected the edges, tightened the rivets, and pressed his thumb into the leather straps to test their strength. A shield might save his life one day, but only if he tended it on all the days that came before. After the weapons came the armour, a project that could swallow entire afternoons. The plates were heavy even in pieces, and removing every strap, hook and fastening revealed all the places where sweat, dirt and grime collected. The gambeson itself absorbed more unpleasantness than anyone liked to admit. The knight or his squire hung it near gentle heat, letting it dry fully before brushing off the dust and loose fibres. The padded layers needed to last, and constant moisture invited mould, rot or stiffening. Armour smelled of iron and earth when it was new. After a long week, it smelled like effort. Each metal plate received the same attention as the sword. First, a gentle scrape to remove rust, then a rub with cloth and oil, bringing back the muted shine that marked a well-kept suit. The sound of this work changed depending on where it was done. In a castle armoury, the tapping of hammers and the grinding of metal formed a background chorus that echoed down the stone halls. In a manor's outbuilding, the sounds were softer. The whisper of cloth on steel, the low clink of buckles, the distant call of animals in the yard. If the knight needed repairs beyond his skill, he walked to the armourer's workshop. That space had its own atmosphere. Metal dust in the air, the constant scent of heated iron, and the rhythmic clatter of tools striking metal. Sparks flew in short bursts as the armourer hammered out dents or reset rivets. The workshop glowed dimly, lit by embers and the flicker of lanterns. The knight watched patiently as the armourer worked, knowing that a single cracked plate or weakened joint could determine the difference between a glancing blow and a fatal one. Maintenance wasn't optional. It was woven into survival. Then came the destrier, the knight's partner in every sense. Before anything else, the horse needed attention. The destrier stood tall, muscular, and always slightly restless, chewing at a bit of hay or stamping a hoof against the packed dirt floor. Grooming it was slower and gentler than weapon maintenance. The knight moved a brush over the horse's coat, gliding it through thick hair, loosening dust and sweat left from training. The smell of hay, warm animal scent, and old leather filled the air. The horse leaned into the brush with quiet approval, its weight shifting in response to the knight's steady hand. Tack, the saddle, reins and straps, required just as much effort as the armour. Leather dried out quickly, especially in winter, and cracked if not cared for regularly. So the knight rubbed each piece with oil or tallow, smoothing the material until it softened slightly under his fingers. The saddle's underside collected dust, hair and sweat. He scraped it gently, making sure no sharp edges remained that could irritate the destrier's back. A knight depended on his horse far more than his armour. The relationship required trust, and trust required care. When all the equipment had been inspected, sharpened, oiled, brushed or adjusted, the knight often stepped back to take in the quiet scene around him. The courtyard or stable felt peaceful in a way the rest of the day never did. Birds called from the manor roof. The wind moved through open doorways. Tools rested in neat rows. It was a moment of stillness that lived outside the obligations of combat or noble duty. Here, everything slowed. Maintenance didn't glorify knighthood, it grounded it. Sometimes these tasks fell to squires, especially after difficult days. But even then, the knight supervised. A loose strap or a neglected patch of rust could cost a life. Every knight knew stories of equipment failures, a shield strap snapping mid-blow, a cinch fraying at the wrong moment, a dulled sword glancing uselessly off armour. These weren't dramatic legends, they were ordinary warnings, so even when the squire worked, the knight watched closely, offering pointers, testing weight, adjusting angles. It was the kind of routine that built trust between them. As the afternoon light faded, the knight often felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. Not pride, just the reassurance that tomorrow's battles, drills or patrols would begin with equipment ready to serve. The rhythm of maintenance gave structure to the day, a balance to the chaos of combat. It reminded him of the countless hands that supported his life, the armourer's skill, the cook's steady meals, the groom's care for the horses, the squire's constant presence. Knighthood wasn't a solitary achievement, it was a collaboration of quiet labour. By the time evening approached, the castle or manor hummed with the softer kind of life. Smoke drifted from the kitchen hearth. Tools hung neatly along walls. The destrier lowered its head to drink. The knight, arms tired from sharpening and polishing, breathed in the scent of oil and hay. There was something deeply human about these moments, a reminder that under the armour and title was a man living within a community of work. Maintenance didn't appear in stories or illuminated manuscripts. It didn't impress visitors or earn songs. But it shaped every moment of a knight's existence. Without it, armour failed, weapons weakened, and horses fell ill. With it, a knight stayed alive. And in the quiet repetition of those tasks, the scrape of stone on steel, the soft thud of a brush along a horse's flank, the distant ring of an armourer's hammer, the day eased into something almost peaceful, a kind of medieval lullaby of labour. A knight lived by steel, but he survived because of this, the endless, necessary, soothing work behind it all. Evening settled slowly over the manor, softening the colours of the day and pulling long shadows across the courtyard, and this was usually when a knight moved into one of his quieter responsibilities, patrolling the grounds. Training drained the body, maintenance tired the hands, but patrolling required something more patient, steady awareness and a sense of duty that extended far beyond the castle walls. As the sun slipped lower, the knight climbed the narrow stone steps toward the battlements. the chill finding him long before he reached the top. At the higher levels, the wind greeted him fully, carrying the familiar sense of wet stone, chimney smoke, and the mix of farmland and livestock settling down for the night. The air wasn't pleasant in a modern sense, but it was undeniably medieval, honest and textured, shaped by fields, animals, and the daily work of the people below. From the walkway, the knight could see the village tucked against the landscape. Thatched roofs clustered near the road, small gardens fading into shadow, and thin trails of smoke rising from evening hearths. The view wasn't grand, but it showed everything he was responsible for. Dozens of families went about their night with the quiet assumption that someone above was watching. Patrols weren't exciting. Most nights followed a slow, predictable rhythm as the knight paced along the cold stone. His boots scraped lightly against the walkway, accompanied by the soft clink of chain or the creak of leather straps. Torches flickered in their brackets, their flames bending with each gust. The smoke had a bitter, resinous smell that clung to the air, and when the wind shifted, it drifted directly across his face. Part of patrolling was simply learning to breathe around smoke. Below, life continued in gentle motion. A stable hand led a horse into its stall, lantern glowing like a floating ember in the dusk. The scent of hay mixed with manure drifted upward, not overwhelming, just part of the manor's everyday backdrop. A pair of guards exchanged a few low words near the gatehouse. Servants carried baskets back toward the kitchens. The manor didn't sleep yet, it simply exhaled. Hierarchy arranged itself quietly in these moments. Guards straightened when the night passed, giving respectful nods. Squires hurried along the lower paths, finishing their last chores before darkness fully arrived. Stable hands acknowledged him only briefly. Horses left little room for social ceremony. The armourer, if still working, barely looked up from whatever metal hissed against his tools. Everyone knew their place, and everyone kept to it. As the knight walked the length of the battlements, he stopped at a wide lookout point where the stone opened toward the fields. The farmland stretched in long dark strips, the soil still faintly marked from recent ploughing. Beyond the fields, a line of trees formed a shadowed border where the forest began. In the fading light, the landscape blended into broad silhouettes. This was the moment patrolling made sense. The land looked vast, exposed, and very easy to overlook without someone standing here. Leaning lightly against the cold parapet, the knight listened. Sounds from below drifted upward in softened form. A muffled conversation, the clunk of a bucket, the bark of a dog in the distance. The wind moved through the arrow slits, creating small hollow tones. Boredom was a constant companion, but it was a manageable kind, the type that let thoughts wander without completely losing focus. Patrolling wasn't about expecting danger, it was about being present. Sometimes another guard joined the knight briefly. They exchanged simple comments about the cold, the harvest, the state of the fences, not because either had something pressing to say, but because conversation broke the long stretches of silence. After a short while, the guard continued on, and the knight resumed his solitary route along the wall. As he moved toward the final stretch of the circuit, the torches behind him cast smaller pools of light, and the courtyard below grew dim. The air cooled more sharply now, brushing against his face and forming light clouds of breath. Lanterns disappeared from the stables one by one. A dog barked again from the village, then quieted. Nothing alarmed him, and that was the ideal outcome. Near the end of the patrol, the knight paused for a final look at the land. The fields had lost all distinct colour, blending into the darkness. Only a handful of warm windows remained visible in the village. The forest was a single block of shadow. No threats approached. No movement stood out. Tonight would end the way most nights did, quietly. That was the truth of knighthood rarely shown in stories. It wasn't built on constant battle or dramatic heroism, but on evenings like this, where a man simply walked the walls, endured the cold, and made sure others slept safely. Patrolling didn't earn songs or praise. It didn't look impressive from afar, but it held the entire structure of medieval life together. The quiet reassurance that someone was keeping watch. And in that stillness, as the torches crackled softly and the wind slipped through the battlements, the knight felt a rare kind of peace settle over him. Not joy and not relief, just the quiet understanding that he had fulfilled one more part of his duty, a small steady pause in a world built on responsibility. For all the physical strain that defined a knight's life, an entirely different set of responsibilities waited quietly in the background, the social duties that kept a manor functioning. These obligations weren't dramatic or heroic, but they shaped the rhythm of medieval life just as much as any battle drill. Many days the knight found that words, presence, and patience demanded far more from him than his armour ever did. Most mornings after training began with petitions. Villagers approached the manor with their concerns, grazing disputes, boundary arguments, questions about marriage arrangements, or small grievances rooted in land and livestock. The knight sat in a simple wooden chair, listening as each person explained their side. Some spoke quickly, others rambled, but he kept a steady ear. Diplomacy here wasn't grand, it was the quiet work of fairness. He asked questions when necessary, recalled which families shared histories, and sometimes postponed decisions until he could walk the land himself. A knight who took time earned trust more deeply than one who ruled from a distance. When the petitions ended, correspondence followed. The writing desk, cluttered but familiar, waited with parchment, a pot of ink, and a soft burning candle. The quill's rhythmic scratching filled the room as the knight wrote updates to his lord, notes on repairs or responses to neighbouring stewards. These letters were the subtle threads tying the manor to the wider feudal hierarchy. They carried responsibility without fanfare, reminding him that his position connected him to something larger than the walls around him. Some afternoons brought fealty ceremonies. A tenant or retainer knelt, hands clasped, swearing loyalty in exchange for protection and land use. The knight responded with vows of his own, promises of fairness and defence. These exchanges didn't happen often, but when they did, the hall grew still. Fealty felt less like ceremony, and more like acknowledging the invisible ties that held medieval society together. Conflicts didn't always wait for formal hours. Sometimes a dispute erupted in the courtyard, raised voices, red faces, and the urgency of everyday life pressing in. The knight stepped in calmly, speaking to each person in turn, walking them through the issue until tempers cooled and a decision could be made. Medieval justice wasn't neat, but fairness came from attention, not speed. Once resolved, peace returned quietly, almost gratefully. By late afternoon, the knight often made his way to the chapel, a small stone room lit by candle rows, smelling faintly of wax and incense. It wasn't grand, but it offered something rare: silence. He sat or knelt, letting the dim light and soft acoustics settle his thoughts. Prayer was simple, often just a reflection on the day or a moment of grounding after hours of decisions. The chapel gave him a space where no one asked for anything, even if only briefly. Some evenings brought small gatherings in the chapel. Villagers arrived with their children, voices hushed in the candlelight, the atmosphere warm and communal. The knight blended in quietly, not as a figure of power, but as someone sharing the same flicker of faith and the same desire for peace at the end of a long day. The murmured prayers rose gently, softened by the stone around them, while the world outside continued its slow drift into night. As he left the chapel, the manor had shifted into its evening rhythm. Servants finished their tasks, guards changed shifts, and the courtyard dimmed into soft shadow. Social duties paused until morning, waiting to begin again with new questions and new conversations. These responsibilities never made it into heroic tales. They weren't sung about or illuminated in manuscripts, but they held medieval life together. The quiet, persistent leadership that shaped a stable world. Listening, mediating, writing, guiding. Small tasks that, woven together, formed the true fabric of a knight's daily existence. Duty, the knight knew, wasn't found in a single moment of glory. It lived in these calm, steady hours, the ones no one ever talked about, but everyone depended on. By late afternoon, the day had already carved its weight deep into the knight's muscles. The morning drills had pressed heat into his shoulders, patrols had chilled his hands, and hours of maintenance had left a familiar ache along his back. Yet another responsibility waited before the sun dipped behind the trees. This was the time set aside for training the squire. No armour to hide behind, no horse to steady him, only the expectation that he would teach a younger version of himself with patience that often demanded more endurance than any physical task. The squire stood in the yard long before the knight arrived. He held a wooden sword that felt too large in hand, still learning their strength. His stance was eager yet uneven, a mix of determination and nerves. 15 at most, still balancing between childhood and adulthood, he watched the knight with a kind of reverence that carried weight of its own. His eyes were bright with hope, his shoulders were stiff with the fear of failing. The knight recognized the expression instantly because he had worn it himself once. Training began with quiet demonstration. The knight lifted the practice blade and moved slowly, letting each motion stretch through the late afternoon air. These movements looked controlled and natural, but they drew effort from muscles already tired, and teaching speed required its own kind of discipline. The squire studied every detail with intense focus. He tried to memorize the arc of the blade, the angle of the knight's stance, the flow of weight from heel to toe. He wanted to learn faster than anybody could reasonably learn, and the knight felt a softened patience at the sight. When the squire attempted the motion, the mistakes came quickly. His feet wandered too wide, his shoulders lifted too high, his grip tightened until the knuckles whitened. The knight stepped forward and adjusted each error with calm precision. He moved the boy's hand a little lower on the hilt. He guided his elbow inward. He shifted the boy's stance until balance settled into place. The corrections were gentle but firm. The knight knew that a harsh tone only stiffened the body and clouded the mind. Teaching required steady breath and steady words, and he offered both even when his own fatigue tugged at him. The boy repeated the sequence again and again, growing hotter and more flustered with each attempt. Sweat rose along his brow, his breath grew louder in the quiet yard. The knight corrected the same mistake more than once. He didn't let frustration show. Every night had begun this way. Progress arrived slowly and sometimes painfully. Skill was a long road, not a sudden leap. Shield training followed. The squire lifted the practice shield with effort, and the knight struck it in controlled rhythms to teach how impact moved through the arm and into the legs. The blows rattled the boy's wrist and elbow, yet he braced himself with determined focus. The shield dipped at times, and the knight corrected him, showing how strength started in the feet, how a grounded stance allowed the body to absorb force without collapsing inward. These lessons shaped more than technique, they shaped temperament. The boy learned how to stay steady under pressure, how to breathe through the moment rather than panic. Footwork came next. The knight demonstrated slow steps and balanced pivots, patterns that seemed simple until one tried to repeat them with tired legs. The squire wobbled now and then, trying to copy the knight's posture without quite understanding how weight shifted through the hips. The knight guided him with small touches and brief explanations. He kept the flow gentle and uninterrupted, so the boy could feel the rhythm rather than think it. Footwork was the spine of all fighting. Without it, nothing else held together. As the session stretched deeper into the afternoon, the knight watched the squire's stamina begin to fade. The signs appeared quietly. The boy's hands trembled when he lifted the shield. His stance loosened. His movements slowed. The knight adjusted the pace without pointing it out. He pushed enough to challenge the boy, but not enough to break his confidence. A squire who felt utterly defeated learned to fear the training yard. The knight wanted him to respect it instead. There were soft moments of humour as well. The boy would sometimes imitate the knight's stance so intensely that it exaggerated into a stiff and awkward pose. The knight kept a straight face even though he felt a faint smile tug at him. Once the squire lunged with too much enthusiasm and nearly lost his balance. The knight steadied him with a calm hand and continued the lesson. These small moments reminded him that mentorship carried warmth as much as discipline. As the sun drifted lower, the knight demonstrated how the day's drills linked into one fluid sequence. The squire watched with renewed attention, even though his arm shook. Seeing the full pattern helped him understand the purpose behind each correction, each stance, each block. He attempted the sequence himself with uneven but real improvement. His movements were still rough, yet there was a new steadiness in the way he carried his weight. The knight acknowledged it with a single quiet word of approval. Just one. Squires did not need speeches, they needed to know effort was seen. When the training finally ended, they returned the practice weapons to their racks. The knight placed a hand on the squire's shoulder, a gesture light and brief yet powerful enough to settle deep into the boy's memory. The squire straightened, tired but proud, and the knight recognized the spark he had felt at the same age. Someone had once guided him with the same patience. Now it was his turn to continue that quiet tradition. As they stepped out of the yard, the evening air cooled around them, and the knight felt the day's exhaustion settle fully into his bones. Yet beneath the fatigue lived a quieter satisfaction. Training the squire did not bring glory or praise, but it shaped the future more reliably than any battle ever could. One lesson at a time, one correction at a time, one long afternoon at a time, the next knight was being formed. And the knight understood the truth at the heart of the role. Steel and armour built the outward image, teaching built the legacy. By the time evening settled across the manor, the fatigue that had followed the night all day finally revealed its true depth. Throughout the morning and afternoon he had moved on instinct and duty, letting the rhythm of training and patrols put a structure around his exhaustion. But once the sun dipped low and the last chores faded away, the aches that had been held back began to rise. A knight's injuries rarely appeared dramatic. They did not shout for attention with blood or broken bones. They arrived quietly in the form of deep bruises, stiff joints, and a steady throb behind the muscles that had carried the weight of armour since dawn. Evening was the only time he allowed himself to acknowledge them. He stepped into the small room where the household kept herbs and cloth, a modest space that smelled faintly of dried leaves and old wood. No trained physician waited there. Only a squire with basic knowledge and a set of simple remedies that medieval households relied on. These remedies were never glamorous, but they worked well enough to keep a knight moving. The squire laid out the herbs on a small table and crushed them with a slow grinding motion, releasing a sharp green scent that cut through the fatigue like a quiet awakening. The poultice had to be warm but not hot, thick enough to hold its shape, gentle enough not to sting. The knight lowered himself onto a bench, grateful for the chance to sit down at last. When the poultice touched his skin, the effect was immediate. Heat seeped into bruised ribs and strained shoulders, spreading with a heavy warmth that soothed in a way almost nothing else could. The herbs smelled earthy and slightly bitter, a mix of plants grown along the manor's edges. The squire pressed the cloth against each spot where the armour had pinched, or where the shield drills had left a dull ache. Some places hurt more than others, but the knight held still, knowing the discomfort was temporary and the relief would linger through the night. After the poultices came the slow assessment of smaller injuries. The knight flexed each hand, feeling the stiffness along the knuckles where the gauntlets had rubbed all day. He rolled his shoulders in measured arcs, listening to the quiet crackling that came from joints pushed far beyond comfort. The sound was not alarming. It was the familiar chorus of a body that worked hard and often. He pressed his fingers along the tendons of his forearm, checking for swelling. Nothing serious, nothing dangerous. Just the usual reminders that armour and weapons demanded repayment in the currency of weariness. When the herbal work was done, the knight followed the squire outside toward the riverbank, where the last light of the evening touched the water with muted silver. The river was always cold at this time of day, yet it was the only reliable place to rinse off sweat and dust. He stepped into the shallows slowly, wincing at the shock of cold that wrapped around his legs. The water bit at his skin but soon numbed it into a tolerable stillness. He cupped the water in his hands and poured it over his face and neck, washing away the grit from training. The river carried the day's harshness downstream and left behind a cleaner, calmer surface on his skin. A few bucket baths waited near the bank, warmed just enough to release faint tendrils of steam into the dimming air. The knight poured one over his shoulders, letting the warmth chase away the last clinging chill from the river. Steam rose in soft ribbons, drifting around him like quiet ghosts. The combination of cold and heat relaxed muscles that had been braced for hours. His breathing slowed, and for the first time since dawn he felt a sense of stillness settle over him. The squire helped him dry off and handed him a simple cloth tunic that felt wonderfully light after a day spent under armour. The fabric rested gently against skin still tender from the weight of metal. Behind them the manor windows glowed with low torchlight, forming soft halos of warmth against the stone walls. Evening in a medieval household carried a peaceful intimacy that modern life rarely offered. The sounds were muted, the air was cool, the light danced across the courtyard without urgency or noise. Back inside the small room, the squire applied the last of the evening remedies. A thin layer of salve made from animal fat and herbs was smoothed across the sore spots. It carried a strong scent that blended smoke, pine, and something faintly sweet. These smells told the story of medieval first aid far more honestly than any manuscript illustration. They were humble and practical and crafted by hands that understood the rhythms of injury and recovery. The knight accepted each small treatment with a quiet nod. This was not luxury. This was the steady maintenance that kept him able to rise again tomorrow. The final ritual of the night was simple. The knight sat on a stool near the low-burning torch and stretched his legs out slowly, letting the heat warm the lines of tension running down his thighs. He leaned forward, feeling the long pull of muscles that had worked since sunrise, and listened as his knees and ankles gave small pops of protest. None of it surprised him. Armour compressed the body hour after hour. Even the strongest joints complained by evening. He held the stretch until the ache softened into something dull and manageable. The torch cast a soft orange glow across the stone walls, flickering gently with each small shift of air. The light was calming, neither harsh nor bright, and it filled the room with a sense of quiet closure. Dust motes drifted lazily above the floor. The squire tidied the herbs and tools with care, moving slowly so the moment would not be disturbed. The knight breathed deeply, letting fatigue settle into a place where it felt natural rather than overwhelming. As the last tasks of the night came to an end, the knight stood with measured slowness. His body still hurt in familiar ways, yet the edge of the pain had dulled. The evening rituals did not erase the strain of the day, but they softened it into something he could carry without resentment. These hidden injuries, the ones no one saw, reminded him that knighthood was built on endurance as much as skill. They were the quiet price of a life defined by duty. And in the dim torchlight, as he prepared to rest, the knight felt the peace of knowing he had tended to every part of his body that demanded care. The world outside settled into darkness, and the manor grew still. Tomorrow would bring new strain and new weight, but tonight carried its own calm promise. The hardest part of the day was finally behind him, and the gentle work of healing had begun. When the manor finally settled into silence, the knight walked the dim corridor toward his small chamber, moving with the slow certainty of someone who understood his own limits. The torchlight along the walls flickered softly, throwing long shadows that stretched and folded like tired banners. His body still ached in familiar ways, yet the sharpest edges had softened, leaving behind a weighted calm he could accept. Every step reminded him of the work he had done, and every breath felt a little easier than it had an hour before. Inside his chamber the air was cool and faintly scented with wood smoke drifting from the hall. A simple straw mattress waited in the corner, its wool blanket neatly folded, its surface worn but welcoming. He sat down with care, lowering himself in a single quiet motion, letting the stiffness in his legs settle into the stillness of the room. The armour was gone, the weight was gone, and for the first time all day he felt the rare lightness of being simply a man, not a symbol of duty. He let his hands rest on his thighs and closed his eyes for a moment. The sounds of the manor were barely there, a distant creak of cooling timber, the muffled clink of a pot being set aside, the faint rush of wind through the outer stones. These small noises formed a kind of medieval lullaby, the quiet backdrop of night spent recovering from long, demanding days. When he finally lay down, the mattress rustled beneath him, and the blanket settled gently across his shoulders. The warmth gathered slowly, seeping into the places the poultices hadn't fully reached, easing the last remnants of strain. His breathing deepened, steady and unhurried, each exhale releasing a little more of the day's weight. The torch outside his chamber cast a dull orange glow through the wooden slats, just enough to paint the room in soft outlines. Sleep did not rush him. It approached gradually, the way evening fog curls across a field, slow, steady, inevitable. The ache in his joints dulled into a muted throb, then softened further, becoming part of the background of rest. He was used to this rhythm: strain, care, quiet, sleep. It was the cycle that allowed him to rise again, day after day, with the same unwavering resolve. As he drifted toward rest, He thought not of battles or oaths, or the many demands waiting for him in the morning. Instead, he felt a quiet gratitude for the simple moments, the warmth of the salve, the cool shock of the river, the steady hands of the squire, the calm torchlight that marked the end of another long day. These were the small mercies that sustained him far more than ceremony or praise. Finally his eyes grew heavy, and the last of his tension slipped away. The Manor's silence wrapped around him like a second blanket, soft and protective. Tomorrow would test him again, as it always did, but tonight carried its own promise, a promise of rest, of healing, of strength slowly returning in the dark. And in that quiet medieval chamber, beneath the gentle breath of torchlit shadows, the knight surrendered at last to sleep.